The voicemail lasted only 11 seconds. At first, it sounded like nothing more than breathing, slow, uneven, nervous. Then came a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "I don't think he's sleeping." A long pause followed, the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the background. Then the message ended. No scream. No struggle. Just silence. When investigators eventually listened to that recording, they couldn't explain why it unsettled them so deeply. There was no obvious threat, no confession, no violence, but there was something hidden inside those 11 seconds, something that would lead them to one of the most disturbing family murders they had ever seen. And at the center of it all was a son. The town knew Margaret Holloway as the kind of woman who remembered birthdays without writing them down. She baked pies for neighbors, volunteered at community events, and never missed a chance to ask someone how their family was doing. People described her as warm, in a way that felt increasingly rare, the sort of person who made strangers comfortable. So when she suddenly stopped answering calls and failed to show up for a charity fundraiser she had organized herself, concern spread quickly. Friends drove past her house. The curtains remained closed. Her car sat untouched in the driveway. Nothing looked wrong, yet something felt terribly wrong. Eventually, a neighbor requested a welfare check. Officers arrived expecting to find a medical emergency. Instead, they found Margaret lying inside her home. The scene was strangely calm. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no obvious indication of a violent struggle. Yet Margaret was dead. Detectives immediately noticed something unusual. Family photographs lined nearly every wall in the house. Smiling faces, holidays, graduations, vacations. But one person appeared more than anyone else, her son, Daniel. In picture after picture, Margaret stood beside him with unmistakable pride. Looking at those photographs, nobody could have imagined that Daniel would soon become the center of a nightmare. Daniel Holloway arrived shortly after police contacted him. He appeared devastated. His eyes were red. His voice shook. He repeatedly asked the same question. "Are you sure?" It sounded genuine, heartbreaking. Even detectives watched him carefully as he walked through the house. He stared at family photos, sat at the kitchen table, and buried his face in his hands. Several officers privately agreed that his grief seemed real. If he was acting, he was exceptionally convincing. Still, something bothered investigators. During the initial conversation, Daniel volunteered details nobody had asked for. He explained where he had been, who he had spoken to, what time he had left work, what route he had driven home. It was an avalanche of information delivered before anyone questioned him. Experienced detectives recognized the pattern immediately. Innocent people often answer questions. Guilty people sometimes answer questions that haven't been asked yet. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make investigators listen more carefully. As detectives dug into Margaret's final days, they discovered that she and Daniel were unusually close. Friends described them as inseparable. After Daniel's father died years earlier, Margaret devoted much of her life to helping her son. She supported him financially through difficult periods, paid bills when he struggled, defended him when others criticized his decisions. Even as an adult, Daniel remained deeply dependent on her. Many people found the relationship unusual, but not alarming. Then investigators uncovered a different side of the story. Financial records showed Daniel was drowning in debt. Credit cards were maxed out. Personal loans had gone unpaid. Collection agencies had contacted him repeatedly. Yet despite his financial problems, he continued spending money recklessly. Luxury purchases, gambling trips, expensive electronics. Friends described a cycle that never seemed to end. Daniel would run out of money, turn to his mother, receive help, and then repeat the process all over again. Detectives began wondering whether money had become more than a family problem. The autopsy complicated everything. Margaret's death had initially appeared natural enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but forensic findings suggested otherwise. Certain injuries raised serious questions. Not dramatic injuries, not the kind seen in brutal attacks. These were subtle, precise, deliberate. The medical examiner concluded that Margaret had not died naturally. Someone had been involved. That discovery transformed the investigation overnight. Detectives returned to the house searching for anything they had missed. Hidden among everyday paperwork, they found handwritten notes Margaret had kept for herself, shopping lists, appointment reminders, random thoughts. One note stood apart from the others. Written hurriedly near the bottom of a page were 6 words: "I don't trust him anymore lately." No name appeared beside the sentence, but investigators immediately wondered who she meant and why she had written it. The deeper detectives looked, the stranger Daniel's behavior became. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him visiting stores shortly before Margaret's death, nothing unusual on its own. Yet investigators noticed inconsistencies between what he claimed and what cameras revealed. Small discrepancies, tiny omissions, individually meaningless, together troubling. Every answer seemed to create new questions. Then the voicemail surfaced. Margaret's phone contained dozens of routine messages, friends checking in, appointment reminders, community organizers discussing events. Buried among them was the 11-second recording. Detectives replayed it repeatedly. The voice was unquestionably Margaret's. "I don't think he's sleeping." The statement seemed bizarre. Who was she talking about? Why did she sound frightened? Most importantly, why had she never called back afterward? Investigators felt they were looking at a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Friends began sharing stories they had never considered important before. Margaret had recently appeared anxious, distracted. She sometimes looked over her shoulder during conversations. One friend recalled Margaret abruptly changing the subject whenever Daniel came up. Another remembered her saying she felt trapped by something she couldn't explain. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Looking back, every memory suddenly carried new weight. Meanwhile, detectives examined Daniel's financial records more closely. What they found shocked them. Several insurance policies existed in Margaret's name. The beneficiary listed on each policy was Daniel. Combined, the payouts could erase nearly all his debts. Investigators still lacked direct evidence connecting him to the crime, but motive was becoming impossible to ignore. Every path they followed seemed to circle back to the same person, the devoted son in every family photograph. Pressure mounted as investigators interviewed Daniel again. This time, his composure appeared less stable. Certain questions irritated him, others made him defensive. When detectives mentioned the insurance policies, his demeanor changed noticeably. He quickly insisted he knew very little about them, yet records suggested otherwise. The contradiction lingered in the room long after the interview ended. Around the same time, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of electronic devices recovered from the house. Most findings were routine: emails, family photos, banking records. Then one technician discovered deleted searches connected to inheritance procedures and insurance claims. The searches had been erased, but not permanently. What made investigators pause wasn't merely their existence, it was their timing. They had been conducted before Margaret died, just as detectives believed they were closing in on Daniel. The case took an unexpected turn. A private investigator hired by distant relatives uncovered evidence suggesting Margaret had recently changed her will. The updated document dramatically reduced Daniel's inheritance. Most of her estate would instead go to charities and community organizations she supported. The revelation stunned everyone. Even more shocking was the date. Margaret had finalized the changes only weeks before her death. Suddenly, the note saying, "I don't trust him anymore lately," carried terrifying significance. Detectives began reconstructing Margaret's final months. A picture emerged of a mother slowly realizing something about her son that she never wanted to believe, something serious enough to change years of financial planning, something serious enough to fear. The breakthrough came from a source nobody expected. While reviewing old security footage unrelated to the homicide, investigators discovered Daniel had secretly entered his mother's home during times he later denied being there. The visits occurred repeatedly over several months. He possessed a key, so there was no forced entry. Margaret likely never realized how often he was coming and going. Then forensic specialists recovered fragments of deleted messages from Daniel's phone. Most were incomplete, but one conversation survived enough to reveal a chilling detail. Daniel had learned about the will change shortly before Margaret died, not afterward, before. Detectives suddenly understood the motive, the timing, and the growing tension between mother and son. Yet one question remained: how had Margaret discovered what her son was capable of? The answer emerged from Margaret's laptop. Hidden inside a password-protected folder, investigators found personal journal entries she had never shared with anyone. Reading them felt like watching a heart slowly break. Margaret described discovering that Daniel had been secretly taking money from her accounts. At first, she made excuses for him. Then she found evidence proving it had happened repeatedly. Confrontations followed. Promises were made. Promises were broken. Over time, fear replaced denial. Margaret wrote that she no longer recognized the son she had spent her life protecting. The final entry was devastating. Margaret explained that she intended to cut Daniel off financially and finalize the changes to her estate. She worried how he would react when he learned the truth. Investigators eventually concluded that Daniel's desperation, debt, and anger collided when he realized the future he expected was disappearing. The son Margaret had sacrificed everything for chose money over the woman who loved him most. The voicemail suddenly made horrifying sense. I don't think he's sleeping. Margaret wasn't talking about insomnia. She was talking about watching someone she no longer trusted wander through her home at night. Someone she feared. Someone she had raised. Years later, people still talk about Margaret Holloway's kindness. But the detail they never forget is this. The person she spent her life protecting became the person she needed protection from. And by the time she understood that, she was already alone in the house with him.